Let's turn our attention now to Standard 4, which deals with duty to employers. And I think that this, for testing purposes, this is something that you want to read carefully. And while I have no knowledge of how the development process of these materials came together, the way I read it, or the sort of the mindset I use, is that it was developed by a committee, and that committee might have included one too many employers. So in other words, when I read through this, it seems like it's a fairly employer-oriented document, and we're talking about leaning against the open door type thing. I'm not talking about massive issues. It's just that the standards for what constitutes loyalty to an employer for test-taking purpose, for answering questions on the exam, what constitutes loyalty to your employer is set fairly high. Right, so all else equal, if I'm taking a CFA exam and I'm asked a question about my employer and I'm not sure is that a violation or not, well, I'm probably going to lean on the side of, yeah, I probably violated something there anyway. So that's just sort of, again, a backdrop to how you might want to consider this. This is an area that's complex, meaning that the ethics material is complex, and sometimes being able to couch the problem with some sort of reasonable backdrop or underpinning will help you a little bit, although in all cases what it's going to come down to is a very thorough reading and understanding the minutia of the area, right? So in Standard 5A here, 4A, this is loyalty. So this is loyalty to our employer we're talking about now. So on matters related to employment, we have to act for the benefit of the employer, and we can't deprive the employer of the advantage of our skills or abilities. Okay, we also can't divulge firm information or otherwise cause harm. Well, so the idea of you're acting for the benefit of your employer, okay, they don't divulge confidential information, okay, don't cause harm, all that makes sense. Okay, so you also can't deprive the employer of the advantage of your skills and abilities. Okay, well, we'll get to talk about this a little more later on, but that means that you are giving a full measure of effort in your responsibilities as an employee. So again, that's sort of a high standard for what would constitute ethical behavior. Maybe not, but nonetheless, that's the way I would read it. Okay, so guidance. We're going to place client interest first. Okay, so client interest always comes first. Okay, but there's going to be this caveat that we have to consider the effects of our actions also on firm integrity and sustainability. So this seems to be a bit of a hedge in favor of an employer, all else equal. Okay, of course we're going to place clients first, but we've got to think about the well-being of our employer as well. So members are encouraged to give employers a copy of the code and standards, and then we should not have incentive or compensation structure within our employment or within respect to outside employment or independent practice that is going to encourage unethical behavior. So, and of course, if we're employees and not employers, well, we don't always get to have a say over the compensation structure, but to the extent that we do have influence, okay, within the employee-employer relationship, we need to make sure that we're not encouraging unethical behavior. And of course, if we're dealing with independent practice, well, then we would have some direct control. So now we're going to see guidance here in three different areas. The first is with independent practice. So if you're planning to engage in independent practice, that means you are working during the day for your employer, and you're going to have some sort of independent practice that would be in any way related to your career, your financial services career, then you have to notify the employer of the services that you're going to provide, the expected duration, okay, and the compensation, and you can't proceed until you get consent from your employer. So you've got to okay this stuff with your employer, and you have to make sure that the employer is fully informed about your intent to do this, to engage in independent practice. What about leaving an employer? Okay, well, remember, we have to act in the best interest of our employer, and we have to do that until our resignation is effective. Okay, so we've got to be working, giving a full measure of effort, giving our employer the full benefit of our skills, okay, as long as we are employed or until they tell us we're not employed, I guess. So remember that employer records on any medium, if you keep them on your cell phone or your home computer, those are property of the firm. Okay, you don't get to take those with you when you leave. Okay, and of course there's a couple of things down here that do give you some advantage, and that is if you're a portfolio manager, so you've helped build a book of business, and you've decided you're going to open up your own shop, or you're going to go to another shop. Okay, well you know who the clients are. So simple knowledge of the names of your clients, or what will be your former clients after you resign, okay, that's okay. But you can't solicit clients prior to leaving. So if you are, you know you're going to be leaving, and you say, look, I'm leaving for this other shop. I'm going to be telling my employer in about a month, but this is what I'm planning to do. Would you like me to come over and talk to you about services we can provide there? I'm doing it because I think we can have better outcomes. Okay, well, you can't solicit the employer's clients to go somewhere else while you were still in the employ of the employer, right? So anyway, once you separate from service, okay, your resignation is effective, then you can go back and you can poach clients because you know who they are, you have some sort of personal relationship with them. That's okay, but you can't take client records and all that sort of stuff because that would belong to the firm. And then finally, in the course of your employment, hopefully you have grown as an individual and a professional. So there's no prohibition on your use of expertise or knowledge that you gained while you were employed. Okay, so maybe your employer is paying for you to be watching these videos, right, in hopes that you are developing yourself and becoming a better financial services professional. Okay, well, if that's the case, that's great. They're helping you learn and grow. Although about now you may be asleep. So anyway, you may not hear me saying this, but if you're still awake, well, that's great. Once you leave the employ of your current employer, okay, all these valuable things you learned about how to leave an employer, those are yours forever. That's your personal human capital. You get to take that with you, okay? And then the final area of guidance here is whistleblowing. And so whistleblowing, that means that you are a whistleblower. You're telling the regulatory authorities, government, somebody with the legal jurisdiction that there has been wrongdoing, right? You're blowing the whistle. Okay, well, that's permitted only if it protects clients, okay, or the integrity of the capital markets. Okay, so and it's certainly not permitted for reasons of personal gain. So if you're going to, get to go on, Good Morning America because you were the whistleblower, and that's really what you wanted, well, that's personal gain. Okay, well, you're not going to be able to do that, or write a book about it. Those types of things. You can only blow the whistle, okay, on wrongdoing if it protects clients or it protects the integrity of the capital markets. So whistleblowing requirements. In terms of recommended procedures here, okay, encourage the firm to adopt policies regarding a bunch of things. And again, depending on where you are in your career, you may not have much influence over this, but to the extent that you do, or as you work into a position where you will have some authority over it, okay, firms should have policies regarding outside practice, non-compete agreements, those types of things. The conditions that are placed on someone who is leaving, resignation, termination, that type of stuff. Incident reporting, so when there is an incident involving some sort of ethics issue, how do we go about reporting that? And then also employee classification, who's full-time, part-time, contractor, how do we separate those out? And if you work with any big firms, then you know that they've gone to great lengths to do that, maybe motivated by a sense of ethical responsibility, but certainly motivated also by a sense of legal liabilities and responsibilities. So most of the big firms have very clear policies on that. So anyway, standard 4A, loyalty. Okay, well, we ought to help our firms come up with policies on these things. What about 4B? This is additional compensation. So if we are taking on independent practice, or we're doing something outside the realm of our responsibilities that are contained within our functionality as an employee, then we're not supposed to accept gifts, benefits, compensation, or any consideration that competes with or creates a conflict of interest with our employer's interests unless written consent is obtained from all parties. Okay? That would mean whoever we're receiving the gift or compensation or consideration from, ourselves and our employer. So everybody has to be looped in, okay, if this is going to create a conflict of interest. So if you were asked to serve on the board of a company, okay, well, this is a larger firm. They're potentially a client of your employer. Well, let's see, you're going to serve on the board, you're going to receive some sort of a stipend for doing that. Okay, so that's compensation, or you're going to go to the annual retreat in the Bahamas, one of the two. Either that would be compensation or benefits or gifts. Well, the fact that you serve on the board could induce conflict of interest with your employer. Well, you've got to rope everybody in order to be able to do that. In terms of guidance here, and so compensation and benefits covers direct compensation by the client or other benefits received from third parties. So doesn't matter who it's coming from. Okay, the idea of written consent from all parties. Okay, email is fine. So in all the cases here where they talk about written parameters, electronic communication over the scope of the ethics and of the code and standards. Okay, email counts as written communication, generally specifically mentioned here. Okay, let's see, in terms of recommended procedures, okay, well, written report to the employer with details of proposed compensation in addition to normal compensation and benefits. I think this probably was covered under guidance as well, but again, we ought to write a letter, write a note or memo that goes to our employer that gives them lots of details. So the incentives should be verified with the offering party, and it ought to talk about the nature of the compensation, the amount, and duration of the agreement. Is this something that's closed end, open end? How is it going to evolve in the future? Those are the types of things that the employer that it's recommended that you make sure that your employer is up to date on. So that is 4B, additional compensation. What about 4C, which is responsibility of supervisors? And this is an area where my experience, my thinking about it is that you should think of this as setting high standards for meeting your responsibility as a supervisor. So if you're a supervisor of other employees, okay, well, you have responsibilities. In fact, if you fail in your responsibilities, okay, so you haven't lived up to this very high standard of supervisory responsibility, okay, if you haven't lived up to it and someone under you violates the code and standards, okay, well, if you're not living up to it, you're in violation anyway. Even if there is no violation of the code and standards specifically, okay, you've got to be a diligent supervisor. Okay, but okay, if someone under you breaks the rules, laws, whatever it is, okay, well, then you will once again have broken this particular aspect, and you now have it complicated by the fact that you have in somehow been, at least in tacit complicit with the employee who actually broke this. So make a reasonable effort to ensure that anyone subject to your supervision or authority complies with applicable laws, rules, regulations, and of course the code and standards. So we've got to make sure that the people that we supervise are being ethical actors in the professional arena. So guidance here: supervisors must take steps to prevent employees from violating laws, rules, regulations, and supervisors must make reasonable efforts to detect. Okay, and when I say there's a high standard here, okay, what I mean is that you have to adhere to both of these words. So as a supervisor, you've got to take steps to make sure that people are educated, that there are controls in place, okay, and that you've made reasonable effort, which I would redefine here as Herculean effort, okay, for exam-taking purposes, to prevent employees from violating the law. But even if you've done all of this prevention stuff, if you haven't been adequate in detecting violations, okay, well then you have failed in your supervisory responsibilities. Or if you're really diligent about detecting violations, you've got a crew of people that goes through to review client trades, looking for some sort of malfeasant behavior, all that sort of stuff, but you didn't do much to prevent it in the first place. Well, you've got to prevent and you have to detect violations here. So the standards are fairly high. Okay, so that's the basic rule here is you have to take steps to prevent and to detect. In terms of recommended procedures, okay, well, adequate compliance procedures need to be clear and understandable. Okay, you have to have a designated compliance officer. So if there is a violation, does everybody know who to go to? There should be some checks and balances so that what if the compliance officer is the one doing the violations? Okay, and then you ought to have some sort of written procedures for reporting violations. All of these things, of course, are firm-wide standards that you as someone who is obligated to live by this code and standard should be engaged in helping develop or encourage, and certainly if they are in place, you should be living within these standards. Okay, in terms of the supervisor or compliance officer, this is kind of our designated officer thing. Okay, well, they're supposed to distribute procedures so that people know what's going on. Those ought to be updated periodically. Okay, I've always liked this word, continually educate staff, right? We're never going to go actually do anything to earn money or to build an organization. We're going to spend all our time educating staff. But anyway, you get the idea. And again, if we were to read the underlying materials here, we would see that it has to be effective education. So you're a supervisor or you are a compliance officer, you're interviewing somebody who is onboarding with the firm, and you push a manual across to them and say, hey, this is our standards and procedures. Okay, I want you to read that, and if you have any questions, get back to me. Okay, well, the fact that you delivered them is not accurate, not adequate. You have to make an effort to make sure that they understand it. So we ought to be reviewing employee actions, and of course, if there is a problem, okay, we ought to have procedures once a violation or suspected violation has occurred. We ought to be able to deal with that in some sort of predetermined manner. So we have procedures that we follow once this violation has occurred. So once a violation has occurred, then we have procedures for doing it. And how do we go about dealing with that? Well, one, we respond promptly. We conduct a thorough investigation. And importantly here, while the investigation is going on, we have put appropriate limitations on the wrongdoer. So until the investigation is complete, there's been some sort of hint or accusation or some sentiment that there could have been a violation of the law or the ethical requirements of the firm, then we've got to have a prompt investigation. It needs to consider all of the facts. But while that's going on, I mean, these can involve, massive trades and over a long period of time. Then there ought to be some limits on the wrongdoer. They don't have exposure or access to certain systems, or they don't engage in some types of client activities, those types of things. So we need to do something with the potential wrongdoer while the investigation is going on. So remember, responsibilities of supervisors. Okay, well, I think this is an area where you ought to think high standards for what the supervisor has to do so that the supervisor would not be guilty, okay, as well as if there's somebody under their authority commits a violation, well, they would be guilty as well if they weren't living up to the responsibilities of supervisors. And I would think, again, interpret this as being a high standard or a high standard to create safe harbor for a supervisor is a good way to interpret this.